All right, welcome back, everybody. Clint and I have actually talked for a lot longer than normal, I guess, in the green room. So I'm excited about this conversation. And to be honest with you, I'm curious to see how this is going to go because we've spent now almost an hour, and I feel like I've gotten to know you really, really well. And I've also listened to some of the other podcasts that you've been on, some of the interviews, and you've told your story. You've got a book that talks specifically about this big thing that happens in your life. And I don't want to give that away at this moment, but there is definitely some big, big transitions and things that you guys had to work through, not only on a personal level, but from a family level. And that is what this whole thing is about. This is the reason why we're doing narrative, is because we are telling stories. The real parts, the real pieces, the heartaches, sometimes the trauma, sometimes situations. I mean, like, dude, I'm actually getting goosebumps right now, just to be totally honest with you. Because I love these things, man. I love to see how people's lives have been transformed and how they're now crafting and writing to be able to leave a super strong legacy behind.
Yeah,
and I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for the time that you're willing to take out of your day to spend with us. I know you're busy. I get it, and I appreciate that more than you know.
No, thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. We did have a great conversation in the green room, and let's go.
Yeah. So as we start with everybody, right? So I want to do this. As we start with everybody, I want to make sure that we kind of get in this ground level kind of a thing and ask the question, who is Clint? Not necessarily what you do, because we'll get to some of that kind of stuff, but who are you? When you, what do you want to be known? Like, who are you?
You know, I love that you frame it that way, by the way, because about 2 years ago, I started answering questions that way, you know, because as men, typically that is the go-to. We go to right to what we do. And I stopped doing that because I realized, you know what? That's not who I am. And so I'll tell you who I am. I'm first and foremost, I'm a husband of 21 years. You know, I'm a believer. I guess I should have said that first. You know, I'm a believer. I've known the Lord. Yeah. You're first. Yeah. But it was about 25 years ago that I made that decision, and that may weave into my a little bit of my story as we talk here as well. But about 25 years ago, I made that decision, and radically changed my life. So I'm a husband of 21 years. I'm a dad. Those are the most important things by far to me. And then I do other stuff, love helping people. Yeah. We'll get into the stuff later.
No, I love that though. I mean, like and it's amazing too. Like you just said, so often we gravitate towards that identity of what we do rather than who we actually are. So it's part of the journey, part of the learning experience, part of who we become and how we actually are be able to start telling our stories. So as you've heard and as people have listened and as we kind of go through this, we kind of start with what's the base? What's the origin story? Where are we going to start in your life today?
Yeah, we're going to start at about 12 years old. And I grew up in sunny Southern California and really had what I would characterize as a pretty normal childhood. Now, that's a relative term, right? Because a lot of times until you get older, you don't realize, well, maybe that wasn't normal. But, it was a relatively normal household. Yeah, totally. So into sports, got to play a lot of sports, football and baseball being the primary two. We were lower middle class, but we actually had a pool. And so, the pool life, the whole thing. So Tim, it was an awesome childhood. And then, I noticed at different times that my parents would get into some pretty major raging fights, but didn't really think much about it. Again, is my only perspective. So I thought that's normal. And so what happened is at about 12 years old, my dad kind of dropped the bomb. My parents had me very late, so they had already been married over 25 years by the time I was 12. And he ended up having an affair. And I'll just kind of speed through this part of my story because it was about a 2-year journey, but he ended up moving out. And during that time, there was a lot of pain. My brother, I have an older brother, but he was almost 8 years older, and he'd already moved away. So he lived several hours away, so it was just me and my mom. They had gotten married at 18 and 16 years old. So, my mom was 16 when she got married. He was a Korean War vet. It's all she knew, So she was devastated, to say the least. But I'm only, 11, 12 years old when it first started. So ultimately, he moves out. We ended up going through a lot of hell. I think I can say it that way. My mom tried committing suicide multiple times. A couple of times she almost took me with her. Once was driving drunk in a speeding car. We actually spun out at about 65 miles an hour in a really dangerous, narrow road in Southern California where I grew up. And totally, I didn't know the Lord back then, but there's no doubt spared my life that day. And then another time with a gun, she basically was threatening to shoot herself. And, we wrestled the gun away from her. And I did it by jumping on top of her. So I had some pretty traumatic experiences. And then what happened that I think really kind of sealed my false narrative, which I know is where we're going to go, was they reconciled for a short period of time during that 2 years and decided that if we just moved away, everything would be great. And so we went from Los Angeles, basically, a little bit north of LA, Southern California, to out in the middle of nowhere, Montana. They bought 20 acres on the Bitterroot River. Yeah, couldn't have been more radical. This is 1976.
That's radical.
It's 1976, wow. Dude. I've got hair down to my shoulders, which was not welcomed much when we showed up in Montana by the other kids. And so we were only there for 2.5 months. My dad ended up literally leaving to go to work one day, we thought, and jumped on a plane and flew back to his girlfriend, left us there. My mom sold the house, the property, all of it within about 24 hours. They lost their tail, financially. And we were back in Southern California. So at the end of this 2-year loop, they ended up reconciling, and my parents ended up being married for over 65 years, and they both passed away about 9 years ago. I had a great relationship with them, so I want to make sure and have that on the record, my adult years. But, it started my first false narrative, and that was that I was on my own and I was alone, that everything was up to me. And
can you kind of dive in just a little bit deeper in that? Like so here's what I find, especially as I talk to people, is sometimes it's something that somebody specifically said to you, whether it was a value statement or a worth statement, something like you're worth, sometimes it's a specifically spoken word. Other times it's a derivative of what you have seen, or you just take away from an experience of, you just make this assumption as a child. So where did that come from when you're saying, hey, I'm on my own? Like, was that something that was just modeled? Was it something like you just made the assumption? Like, where did that belief that you're stating there, where did that come from, or how did it develop?
Yeah, well, at the time, of course, it was totally subconscious. I had no idea. And it's only really been in the last couple of years because of what I do is I'm, heavy into, executive coaching and neuroscience and neuroplasticity and all those types of things. And so, it was totally subconscious. It wasn't anything that I was doing that I was 100% aware of. And I think where it came from, Tim, was simply, I said my dad was a Korean War vet. My dad was a very hard worker. So I did grow up with a sense of strong morality when it came to working really hard and, paying for your own stuff. He was the 30-year gold watch, guy who worked his way up through Pac Bell back in the day when it was still Pac Bell, that kind of thing. So he instilled in me that, and he was not gone a lot, but we didn't do a lot of stuff together. And I think there was a lot of contributing factors like that. But ultimately, when that whole 2-year period happened and I'd been left, because that's how I felt. I felt like I can't trust anything about you guys anymore, meaning my parents. Between him leaving us and then her committing suicide, and there was a lot of ugly scenes wrapped up in that 2-year period. So I think again, it was subconscious. I just decided I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and nobody's going to tell me any different. And, so I'm basically on my own. And so even though I wasn't physically on my own, I did make a lot of my own decisions, even as a teenager. I got heavy into drugs. Thank God I had sports, because in my early teens, up until I was about 20 years old, because I played junior college football, and that was kind of when it all ended. That was the one thing that kind of kept me on track. But I started abusing drugs and alcohol about 12, 13 years old, right after all this happened. And I remember my mom trying to catch me several times. And really the gist of it was, I wouldn't even get grounded. I think the gist of it was they carried so much guilt that they didn't really want to call me anything. So in an indirect way, I was totally empowered to be on my own and kind of quote unquote be my own man. It was that generation, I'm sure you can agree, where you even get hurt.
Yeah, the Gen X generation, we have a lot of the same similarity type stories.
You get hurt, you rub dirt on it, or we used to say tape an aspirin to it and get back in the game, stuff like that.
Yep.
So I just took that attitude into life, and, obviously a train wreck was waiting for me.
Well, but I think it's interesting because and there's two things that I want to bring out just in that short little segment there that you're talking about. But there's two things. One, and I think this is really important for us to recognize, is you mentioned that there was a positive aspect to the traits or the belief that your father was passing along.
Yeah.
And that's the hard work,
Yeah.
and that's definitely a positive thing. There's nothing negative about having a good work ethic, being there and capable, and somebody that you can be leaning upon, like somebody can lean on you and they can trust you and they can all that positive things. But then there's also the negative that comes. So there's definitely a dual side to that. The second part of that you were talking about is the fact of the subconscious part, and this will probably transition into the awareness and the circumstances that kind of brought this to light.
Yeah.
I think so many individuals, so many men and women go through life with a belief that is a subconscious belief, and you just operate in your life based on that belief. You don't even realize, like, oh yeah, I'm on my own.
Absolutely.
Like it reminds me of that Toby Keith song, is like, how do you like me now? And I don't know if you follow country music.
I love country. I like a lot of music, but I'm definitely a big country fan.
Yeah, so he sings that song, and like that is the, I don't know, anthem, I guess, for a lot of Gen Xers. It's like, how do you like me now? Because you did all this stuff to me, and I did all that, but here I am now, and I did all of this on my own, and it's just such a broken kind of philosophy. So, let's transition into that.
Yeah.
How did you realize? Because if it's subconscious, that means it's not fully aware. It's a blind spot. It's not something that's right in front of you. How did you become aware that, oh man, I do believe that I'm on my own and I'm not asking for help, or I'm struggling trying to get everything done by myself? What were the circumstances or situations that brought that to light?
Yeah, well, and it was over the course of years too. So for me, it wasn't any one singular thing. But ultimately, I'll fast forward through my early 20s there, but it's an important part of telling this story. So I got into the car business at 21 years old, and that's where I was actually exposed to meth. And so I abused meth pretty hard for about 9 years, and other stuff too. Basically, if it didn't involve a needle, I was going to try it and probably use it. Basically, is how it was. And so, but I was and this is such a bad phrase because there's no such thing really, but we all have used it. I was a functioning drug abuser. I did my job more often than not. I did it well. I paid my own bills. I wasn't the guy you typically think of when you think of a dude who did meth for 9 years, right?
Yeah.
But then I also ended up in a marriage. And in that marriage, both of us had all of these, just horrible things. She had been abused sexually multiple times, had multiple abortions. I had some of the stuff that I just described to you. So we both were two train wrecks just trying to find each other. And so none of that went well. And ultimately, after 5 years of being in that marriage, she divorced me. And that was shortly after I gave my life to God. And so it was really, I would say, I quit meth, literally cold turkey, which I know is hard for some people to fathom. But that's literally what happened. I woke up one morning, day Tim, and I thought, okay, I don't want to be that dude anymore. I'm done with that. Now, plenty of other flaws, but I just said, I'm done with that. Okay. So that was one. Then we ended up in a divorce. That was embarrassing to me, even though my parents had all the issues that they had, they were still married. Right. So that was embarrassing. And then, I'd given my life to the Lord. That's when things began to shift, even though I ended up going through that divorce. And then the Lord moved me to Texas. And that's when things really began to take a positive trajectory. And I think on some level, to stay on track with your question, that I realized on certain levels that I had kind of been my own guy. And, I remember when I first gave my life to God, the most profound thing that I would hear God telling me, and I don't mean audibly outside, just, as I would study or worship or pray or whatever, is his son. He kept calling me his son over and over and over and over again. And so I think there was a layer, because we're going to go to another layer when we go back within the last 5 years of what happened here in just a little bit. But I think I just began to realize there was these layers of that. And I really felt like I had given that part up, and that I was now dependent on God and no one else and not myself, and lived that way for many years. And I would even say it was sincere and was real for the better part of 15 plus years, until I suffered the greatest tragedy of my lifetime. And then that old wound got ripped open in a really powerful way. And, even as you and I had the pre-conversation in the green rooms, even since we started talking, is when I realized, wow, I actually carried that, or that came back into my life again, that same false narrative. And I had to conquer it again.
Yeah. I liken this onto, like you mentioned, you entered into that first marriage and you guys, it literally is like you've got all of these garbage bags in your house and not even knowing
Yeah.
where to start to clean up,
Right.
right? And so your first decision was, I'm quitting cold turkey meth. That's one garbage bag that you take out, but that doesn't mean that it's clean. I mean,
Right.
like you've got so
Right.
many more things that you've been carrying forward. And let me maybe put this into different words. And you tell me if this is correct or not. The false narrative is I'm alone. And then you start hearing this other narrative that starts coming in, and it's I belong.
Yeah.
Because you said he's calling you your
That's
son.
right.
And just that start, it's not and I love that you said it's a fade. Like it's like this slow growth, because it's not something that happens overnight. It's not a quick switch. It's not a boom, boom kind of a thing. Although some things can be, but most of it's not. Most of it's a growth process. As you stepped into this, how many times did you have to be reminded that you belong?
Oh, geez.
As you kind of fell back into old habits, and as you fell back into old things and old ways of doing life, like how many times was that? Kind of walk me through that little piece real quick. Oh my
gosh, yeah. Thanks for asking that question. I mean, too many to count. I don't even know.
That's kind of what I figured.
Yeah,
but I mean, like that I think is a really important aspect of this.
Yeah, I think. I mean, if I had to try and put a time frame on it, I would say probably at least the first 5 to 10 years after I was 31 when I gave my life to God. I'm almost 59 now. I would say it was a good 10 years plus before I really felt like, and not that I ever felt like I've made it, I'm perfect now. Not that, but very confident that I'm a son and that the Lord is, he's in everything and he's guiding me, and, not quite bulletproof, but close to it.
Yeah, and I want to make this a crystal clear point, because I know this, and I think you would agree. It's never a switch. It's never an instant. It's in our society, we look and expect things to be instant. Yeah. Every growth that I have had personally has been over years, not over a day, not over a 24-hour time.
Absolutely.
We don't have anything that's instant. And so some of these things, and especially as we talk, and if there's nothing else, I mean, this is a big takeaway, is it's going to take time to heal. It's going to take time to grow.
Yeah.
Those two things, you have to realize that you are going to have to take the time. You have to be patient with yourself.
You do. And a lot of beautiful things were happening during those 10 years too. You know, so there is pain, there is growth, there's maturing, there's all those things that are happening that are uncomfortable, but there was a lot of blessing, there was a lot of joy, there was a lot of accomplishments, there was significant change. There was, I've always said it this way, Tim, even, I didn't mention this earlier, but I was a pastor for over 17 years. I've always said it's a mixed bag. Life is a mixed bag. There's a lot of great things to celebrate, and I think gratitude is a force in and of itself. But there are going to be challenges for everybody.
Right. So you mentioned this whole Band-Aid got ripped off, wound got ripped open. Basically your stitches popped, and man, it's all exposed again. You want to step into that at this time?
No, I think good timing. So, ultimately I ended up meeting my bride, Amaryllis, shortly after I moved here to Dallas, but about a couple of years. And so we were about 15 years into our marriage. Well, more than that, actually. I guess we were about 17 years into our marriage. And at that point, 3 boys, love and life, Tim. I mean, really love and life, involved in ministry at that time, had moved back. We had traveled a little bit, and just for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go to all the places we traveled, but we had recently relocated back to Texas, which is where we have some family and we love to be. And so everything's going great. And my oldest son, Gabriel, he, at the age of about 8, he had decided that he wanted to become a pilot. And we didn't know if that was going to stick or not. So, okay, next week you want to play in the NFL, whatever, But it did. It stuck. And then by the time he was 14 years old, starting in a freshman high school, which was the year we moved back here, he had an opportunity. And we didn't even – this is another one of those God things, right, where we just feel like God's just opening the door to everything, every dream our entire family is having. Our school here, our school district has a 4-year aviation educational program. There's not many in the country, and we didn't even know it. And there was that. And then he joins this air club out in the airport about 7 minutes from our house, and it's a guy who started a club for teenagers specifically if they had interest in the aviation industry, including wanting to fly. And so he joins this club and he's on his way. And by the time he's 16, he's soloed before he had even had his driver's license. He couldn't even drive alone. He's up flying a plane alone, which was a weird experience. And then by the time he was 17, that's the youngest you can be to get your private pilot's license certificate. And he did it. And he accomplished his first goal. He had taught himself guitar. He was a professional photographer. I mean, he was just graduated a year early from high school. I mean, he was just the consummate champion, killing life, just killing it. And we thought everything was perfect. And then on September 23rd of 2019, it was just what appeared to be a normal day. About 4:00 in the afternoon, he's walking out the door and, hey, Dad, I'll see you later. And I'm just like, okay, bub. Well, that night he had flown a friend. He had a dear friend that attended the University of Arkansas, which is a couple hours north of us. And he had flown her back there to get her back to school so she wouldn't miss some classes. Ironically, she was here for a funeral that weekend. And after he dropped her off, he was on his way back and he got about 20 minutes out of Fayetteville. And the NTSB would rule a couple years later that he ran into an unexpected weather system, suffered from spatial disorientation, which a lot of the people listening to us may not know what that is, but everybody's familiar with the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash. And that was in a multi-million-dollar aircraft with a guy who had 5,000 hours, and that's what happened to him. And Gabriel crashed and died. And when that happened, Tim, you can't really put it into words. You can try. And, I've articulated the story many, many times, but it was truly, a parent's absolute worst nightmare. And in the wake of that, Tim, here's what's interesting about where we're going to go with this story and that false narrative clawing its way back into my life. My initial response to that was the morning after the accident. When I say the morning, he crashed on the evening of the 23rd. We didn't know for sure that he was gone until about 3:30 a.m. And my other two boys, who were 9 and 14 at the time, didn't know anything. And so when they came out, I had the daunting task of having what I now call the impossible conversation, telling them what happened. And so ultimately, that's where I found myself. And I knew God was with me. And the way I approached it with my boys was twofold. One was, we have two choices. We can choose to get trapped in the tragedy of how Gabriel died and all the things we're not going to have now, with him, all the experiences, all the dreams, all the goals, his dreams, our dreams, all of it. And if we do that, we're going to be shadows of who God created us to be. And then I looked at them all, including my wife, and even my in-laws were here at that time as well. I looked at them all and I said, but there's a second choice, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to choose life. We're going to choose to live the way that he lived, and that's how we're going to honor God, and that's how we're going to honor Gabriel. And the second piece, which we don't need to get into in depth, but it was just how we were going to grieve it out. I said, listen, at that point I've been in ministry for over 15 years and seen a lot of things, been in rooms with people dying and stillborn. And, I've been in a lot of tough situations with people. And I said, I don't know what this is going to look like, but I know this, we're going to do this together. And so everybody needs to know that we're going to talk out loud. We're going to cry out loud. We're going to scream out loud. We're going to laugh out loud. We're going to do it all, and we're going to do it together. And that's kind of where we got launched out. But Tim, after a period of time, once the weight of losing Gabriel really set in, I think that's when, and again, it was subconscious for a period of time. That's when the claws of that false narrative that it's all up to me again. God, where were you? I thought I was protected from this. We were doing we had launched a church, that God had asked us to launch, and I didn't want to launch. It's just, I had never wanted to plant a church my entire life. And here we are just trying to be faithful, and everything just seemed like it was just so precisely headed in the right direction. And we were pushing all the right buttons spiritually, emotionally, physically, all of it. And then the world just got turned upside down. And I'm like, where are you? Where did you go? Why was I not protected from that? And so that kind of began a new journey for me of tackling this whole idea again of, is God really good? And if he is he really my father? And am I really his son? And am I really not on my own? Is it really not all up to me? Is there something I could have done different? I mean, all these things run through your head, you know?
Well, and I would say that, if you summed it all up, it's that whole feeling of being abandoned again as
100%.
an individual.
Yeah.
And then not only being abandoned again, but now you've got the responsibility of a wife and two boys, and they're leaning on you
Right.
and looking to you for this support, the emotional support, physical support. And everybody's looking to you and saying, how are you going to help me? And yet at the same time, you're in the midst of that pain and you're falling back and feeling like you're alone. That same narrative that you just brought up earlier in the conversation is, man, I'm alone.
It's back. Yeah.
So when you're looking at that, and this is where we really look at how do we craft and how do we break some of these false narratives, but what were the things, and whether they were specific or sometimes, and I'm very grateful that you said you gave yourself time to grieve and that you were allowed to grieve, because that was another thing with Gen Xers. We weren't allowed to actually show our emotions. So that's a positive thing there. But what were the things that you would say were critical in mentally and physically and emotionally being able to craft and create the narrative as you move forward in the midst of all of the feelings of being left alone, of being betrayed, or however you want to describe that emotional state? What were the things that you did to be able to say, we're going to celebrate?
Yeah.
We are going to do this together. How did you enforce that? Because, man, it's when you feel it, you don't want to act on it. I mean, but that's obviously the way this whole thing works, is you act first and then you feel second, right? So you have to act and then you feel, right? But go ahead. What were the actions? What were the things that you did?
Well, and the battle this time over that false narrative was a relatively quick one. It didn't happen for long. And I think we even had a little bit of this discussion when we had talked in the green room. I had kind of my Job moment when I realized that I was beginning to feel that way, that I felt like God had really abandoned me and that he let me down. And because in the early stage, first couple, 3 months, I really didn't deal with that. And I think a lot of that has to do, you said a lot of it, actually, just the way you framed the question, because having the responsibility of still being a husband and, doing my part to make sure that I'm supporting my wife the best I possibly could through that, especially the early phases. Being a father, those things are pretty, pretty important mantles that you just can't set down, or I couldn't. Right.
Correct.
So there was a lot of that keeping me pointed in the right direction, just out of sheer responsibility. I don't know that we'd be having the same conversation if I was like separated or divorced and then, single when that happened. Maybe a different story. But so those things kept me calibrated. But ultimately, I was like Job. I was like, why? Why this? Why this way? And I came to a conclusion that not everybody loves, because I've over the last 5 years in particular, I've talked to a lot of hurt people, a lot of people that have suffered major forms of loss, not necessarily like mine, because there's all forms of loss. You can lose careers, you can lose limbs, you can lose all kinds of things, right? But ultimately, for me, I realized very quickly that as a father, there wasn't an answer that God could give me as far as a why goes that would have been palatable. There wasn't one. And I recognized that. And I think that was part of my process of just coming to the conclusion that, I'm just like Job. Who am I? I don't know anything. What do I know? And interestingly enough, Tim, I want to share this really quick. I was shocked when I read this. 15 minutes before we got on this, I made a discovery that I had never seen before. Because one of my challenges and why I ended up feeling abandoned is I grew up outside the church, but I spent the last 25 years in church. And one of the things that I would pray, and I'd heard prayed many times, is, hedge of protection. We'd pray a hedge of protection, around our kids all the time. And yet my hedge didn't happen. And I actually you're going to be blown away by this. 15 minutes before I started preparing for this interview with you, I got an email from, it's a guy that I follow who's an expert in the Jewish and Aramaic language, and he does word studies. And today's word study was hedge. And that hedge is the word sukkah, and it has a couple of different usages. And this isn't preachy, guys. Anybody who's listening right now, this is going to be a really quick run. I got to make this point. It means protection and covering, but it means it by intermingling and weaving throughout. It actually can be translated like the word intercourse as well. And it means that intermingling with the love and nature of God. It's not a physical hedge of protection. It's a hedge that we are intermingled with the love of God, and God will never take that from us. He will always love us through it. But Job was tempted, and I was tempted, because you can choose to walk away from it. And when I read that, I was blown away, and I realized that that's exactly what the enemy was trying to do when that wound got ripped off, and he was trying to take me down that old narrative. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to unmingle me from the hedge, the love of God. And ultimately, I had to fight, and I had to, just ask for forgiveness. And I began kind of a new journey, in my opinion. Even though I've walked with the Lord many, many years, I felt like I was kind of starting over. And there's a whole lot we can go with there, because my life radically began to shift after Gabriel's passing. And this was a big key.
Well, I think that ties in exactly with the false narrative that you started with, the fact of saying I'm alone, and then the transition and the realization that I belong. And then you brought up this whole point about the hedge and how it's intermingled and it's woven together, and and this whole situation is truly one of the greatest false narratives that we deal with in our society, is the fact that they're trying to diversify and separate us out from our communities and from that strength, and from where we find that love and that contentment, for lack of a better word. But it's just amazing when you start to look at that, is that how you have had to continue to fight and make sure that I'm going to say, no, I'm going to stay within this community. I'm going to stay within the love that I know that God's shown on me, and the love that my family's given me, and making that unit the strongest unit that you can be. And that's a daily thing. I mean, I know as a dad, as a husband, it's a daily thing that you constantly have to fight, create experiences, and do that kind of stuff. So is there anything?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do want to add something to what you just said, because I think this is a really important distinction on what that process was like. When I was going through those few months, because it was a few months where I was kind of fighting that old narrative again. And what I began to realize was that, and this, to me, to this day, I actually shared this recently at a keynote event I did. To me, the most amazing thing about going through this experience with losing Gabriel in terms of my relationship with God was that period of time, those few months there, where I wouldn't say I turned my back on God. Like I didn't turn my back and just say, I'm done with you. I don't want anything to do with you. But Tim, my prayer life wasn't the same. I wasn't journaling. I wasn't doing all the stuff that I was doing so perfectly before that I thought would earn me that hedge of protection. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
And then I realized his presence never shifted. And that's what this word means, the sukkot, this intermingling love. His presence, even though I was turning and maybe in the process of turning completely away, I can't answer that. But even as I was doing that, his never shifted. And even when I was angry, and my wife would tell you the same thing if she was on this interview, even if she was angry, even if we were hurting, even if we were crying, even if we were watching our kids, because, our kids have gone through the grieving process as well, clearly. Even through all that, the love and presence of God was always 100% present. And that blew my mind. And that eventually would lead me to probably the healthiest place I've ever been in.
Yeah, I can totally see that. So as we conclude, as we wrap up, takeaway, what would be the one thing, if everybody missed everything else, what would be the one thing that you would want them to recall?
Yeah.
To put into practice, maybe even. That might be a better way to put it.
Yeah, as far as the things we just said, I think having an active relationship with God is obviously the most foundational, but I also had a small circle of prayerful, very mature friends and loved ones who are believers that walk this journey with us as well. And so even though we didn't implicitly say this, we didn't do any of this alone. Remember, my narratives was you're alone. I didn't
right.
do any of this alone. And it wasn't just me and God. I did it with a group of people. And that was massive, you know. And then I want to say one thing that we didn't say that I want to encourage everybody who's hearing this is, if I had a second false narrative, it was that there's more time. And there's something about when you lose someone this close to you that we all know it, you know, cognitively we understand that. But when it happens to you, it's a whole different animal. And so I think that was the other thing is I began to make completely different decisions. So did my wife. We started businesses. I had been asked to write a book for probably 15 years. Finally wrote the book, you know, really just began to realize we truly don't know. I mean, like for real, we don't know how much time we have left. And I can't, and I'm not saying I don't have a day where I'm like, well, I didn't really get much done today, but you know, I just really started living much more intentionally with my relationships with my wife. We started looking at who we hung out with and who we spent our time with. I don't spend time with people that I'm not either pouring into or I'm getting life back from. I don't do that stuff anymore.
Right.
Because there's just not enough time, Tim.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. So true. So I know you wrote a book. I know we kind of just briefly talked on that, and it goes into a lot more depth of this part of these parts of the story. So that is one thing. How can people get in contact with you? What's the best way to get in touch with you? I know we connected through LinkedIn, but share with us the best way to connect.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're in business, there's a lot, we didn't get into a lot of things I quote unquote do. I do some things that may be very interesting to some of you listening. So find me on Clint Hatton on LinkedIn. That's pretty easy for the business side of things. But as far as my story, Big Bold Brave, the book, all those things related to just who I am as a human being now, they can just go to my website, bigboldbrave.us. And you're going to be able to find everything there. You know, you'll find my book, you'll find the ability to bring me in to speak, because I do a lot of speaking, both in the corporate realm, in the church realm, and those types of things.
Perfect. Well, again, man, I thank you, because this has been just incredible. And I think there's some key takeaways that we all can relate to in the fact of being alone versus the fact that we do belong. And I truly believe with all my heart, maybe one of the greatest false narratives of our time is the fact that we're alone. And so many people buy into it. So many people just take it right in, subconscious or conscious, either or. And they just say, hey, we're alone. And then they don't reach out. They don't ask for help. They don't stay in community. And I love all that what you said, because all of those key elements come together to allow you to know that you do belong, and there's people that are willing to help.
That's exactly right.
And so as we conclude, as we kind of wrap up everything, I want to tell everyone that's listening, obviously, we've got multiple channels. We put out segments. If you're seeing a segment, great. If you're seeing part of it on podcast, YouTube, we've got a Discord channel that you can join. You can also be a part of some of the conversations. We ask questions that you can think about, all in effort to be able to help grow and let you know that you do belong, that you are part of it. And the most important takeaway is you need to keep writing and crafting your narrative, because it's important. Everyone's story counts for something, and you can give back. Even if you don't think you can definitely give back to somebody that's struggling, and come in and support and encourage them. So until next time, thanks, guys. Keep listening, subscribe, and we'll talk to you guys soon.